When I read a piece of literature, or I see a movie, or listen to a song, there are many ways that I need to consider it in order to get a complete understanding of it. A lot of times when we're in the entertainment world and we're listening to music or we're watching a movie or a TV show, we don't really think about it that deeply, and that's okay because it's entertainment. Even I have what I call my candy reads. They're not books that I read to get in depth on anything. They're meant to distract me from the world around me. But when we want to truly get to something deeper, there are contexts or lenses, if you will, that you should consider in order to understand more deeply what the author or the lyricist or the playwright or the artist was trying to get at. Anytime I'm looking at, let's say, a movie, the first response that I'm going to have to that is my viewer response. Or if I'm looking at a piece of literature, it's a reader response. And basically, this is going to be very specific to the individual. This is going to be determined based on who I am as an individual, what I've experienced, where I live, what my biases are, what I like, what I don't like. There's a lot of emotional reaction to this. Assuming the art is done well, you'll have an emotional reaction. It's important to know that this response can change. I don't know if some of you have ever watched a movie when you were young, and then when you got older, you watched the same movie and you thought, good heavens, why did I ever think that was a good movie? Or, oh man, this is a lot better than I remembered it. It's not necessarily because you forgot. It might be because you've experienced different things that make you appreciate different parts of the movie. So it's important when I am interacting with a text or a movie or a song that I understand that it's me as an individual that's going to influence the way I understand it. So I can identify that, so it's not to project some bias onto the author or the playwright or the lyricist. After that initial gut reaction, there are some other things that we need to consider. So if you look at the picture that I have in front of you right now, you'll note that, well, hopefully you'll note that that's Nicolas Cage, and that is a snap from the movie National Treasure. And in that movie, he believed, for those of you who never saw it, I'm going to give you a quick rundown. He believed that there was a treasure map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. So, of course, he stole it because he thought somebody else was going to steal it and destroy it. And upon doing that, discovered that there was, in fact, a map, and there were different ways to reveal that map. And one of the clues led him to this what he called Ocular Device. And you'll see the device that he has there, and you'll notice that the device has multiple lenses, and those lenses are able to be manipulated. So some can be moved away, so there's only a certain combination, and some can be added. So I'm going to use this kind of symbol, if you will, to talk about how we can view literature among other art. So when we talk about the lenses, I want you to understand that sometimes those lenses aren't all together. Some of those lenses we're going to be looking at one at a time in isolation, and then sometimes we're going to have to, drop that red one or move that blue one out of the way. Okay, so when I talked about the reader response lens, this would be just the eyeballs. I'm going to add my own little ocular device there. Clearly, I'm not an artist. So this is my gut reaction. This is without anybody else's lens or filter to consider. There are other lenses, like I've said, and if you were to go into college, a college course, or talk to any critics out there, they would give you a big long list of all the different lenses that are out there. We're only going to talk about a few in our class. So we're going to talk about 4 of them in particular, and there are probably 10 or 12. But the 4 that we're going to talk about are, I'm going to start with this one, which is the historical context. So when I talk about the historical context, what I want to consider is two things. I'm going to have to consider two things. Actually, for all of these lenses, I'm going to have to consider two things. But these two things are, one, what is the historical context of the microcosm? Which, if I were to use my roots, micro means small, and cosm means world. So when I'm talking about the microcosm, specifically in a literature class, I'm talking about the world of the literature, aka the setting. This is the when and the where of the book. If I were to climb into it, where would I be in the world? At what point in the world? And that's really important to understand, because sometimes the conflicts that are presented would be very different if it wasn't set during that time period. And I'm thinking specifically of like The Great Gatsby, which was set in the 1920s. And so much of that plot would be really different if it were, say, set in the 1970s. Because there was, like in America, the 1970s and 1920s were very different worlds and what was going on in the world. So it's important to understand that that would greatly change the book if that setting was different. So the historical context is really important in order to understand like the deeper meaning of that book. Okay? Now, in addition to the microcosm, I also need to consider the macrocosm. And similar to microcosm, you'll notice the roots, cosm meaning world, and macro means large. When I talk about the macrocosm, I'm talking about the bigger world, the world of the author. Now, with Miss Link, you guys would have talked about the occasion, which is very similar, almost identical. You know, what was going on in the author's world or in the world at large when the author picked up the pen? And did that influence the writing of the book or the meaning of the book? So those are the two different ways that I need to consider historical context. Okay? The next context that we're going to talk about, and this is when some of the lenses start to overlap and influence each other. This is the cultural context. Okay? Now, cultural context has a lot to do with identity. Different things that establish what somebody's identity is. Now, for cultural context, we're going to be focusing on the three big ones, I call them. There are obviously other things that impact somebody's identity, but this is going to be race or ethnicity, religion, and nationality. Okay, so when I talk nationality, I'm talking like where in the world they live. Race or ethnicity, obviously we're talking about color of skin. Nationality and race and ethnicity often overlap. Talk about, you know, like Inception, we're overlapping within an overlap. And same with religion. So these aren't necessarily all standalone, but they can be addressed independently. So when I look at a piece of literature like Night by Elie Wiesel, which everybody should have read in 10th grade, and I look at the microcosm of that book for the cultural context, we're talking about nationality, we're talking about they were in Poland, so they were Polish. Religion, we were talking about Jews. Race and ethnicity wasn't a big deal for the Jews, but it was for the quote-unquote antagonists. I mean, they're not really antagonists because they're real people, the Nazis. So all three of those, the cultural context is huge when I look at the book Night. And it's something to consider, because if I don't understand those things, I don't understand the meaning of the book. It gives me a more profound depth in order to understand what Wiesel was trying to get at. Okay? And the last one we're going to talk about in this particular film, film, this is a film, as much as I don't consider myself a actress. We're going to do one more. And this is gender. Okay. Now, back when I went to school, back in the day, this was often called the feminist context because it was more of a focus on females and the female roles in society. I prefer to call it the gender context because I don't think that females are the only ones who are pigeonholed, and I don't think that those exist in a vacuum. I think that there's our roles in society are often pitted against each other and play off of each other. So I think it's important to look at both genders within the context of a piece of literature. And now, more recently, we're talking about gender identity and the construct of what gender means as far as, is it biological or is it societal? Like a construct that is put together in society. So when we're talking about the gender context, I want you to think about the book Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson. You read that in 9th grade. And I think if the main character of that book had been male, that would have greatly changed the plot and the meaning of the book. The fact that she was a female, a middle school female, and that she experienced rape, would have been drastically different had that been a middle school boy who experienced that. So, not to say either one of those would be worse. They would both be horrible events. But anyway, to look at that and understand that without knowing that this was a very specific event for a female, I think the book would have changed meaning completely. And when I consider the author in this particular context, or particular book, the fact that Laurie Halse Anderson actually experienced rape in her life and used that as part of her motivation for writing and her background research, if you will, for writing that book, I think that's significant as well because it helps me to understand versus somebody who had not experienced rape, would they have been able to write the book as well or as clearly. And a good example of how the person of the opposite gender or opposite culture or somebody from outside of the historical context in which a book was set would impact it is, if you look at those of you who are familiar with Game of Thrones, it's a mini-series on HBO, but it's based on a series of novels, and George R.R. Martin is the author of those novels. And I've never read them, I've never seen them, but one of my favorite quotes is when he was being interviewed and the interviewer asked, there's one thing really interesting. I noticed that you write women really, really well and really different. Where does that come from? And Martin replied, well, I've always considered women to be people. So it's interesting that a male author is expected not to be able to write female characters because they don't understand them, evidently, according to that interviewer. So that's something to consider when we're talking about the gender construct. So what's really important to remember is, now I gave you examples of books where all of those things were pretty important to understand, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're just part of the story and it's not part of the meaning as a whole or the deeper meaning of a book. So if I'm looking at the historical context, of Speak, do I think that would have had a different impact on the story if that were set in the 1980s instead of, the early 2000s? No, I don't. So even though we could identify the historical context for Speak, I don't know that it would be a big deal if it were changed. So it's important to be able to look and see whether or not it's actually something that's significant to the events and the themes of the book, or if it's not. Then you wouldn't have to consider that for your analysis. So the next video, I'm going to give you an example or an in-depth breakdown of how these lenses overlap. And then we're going to apply that to Kill a Mockingbird.